Let us have a look at the question that I've posed on the screen now, which is how worried should we be about the levels of federal or public debt in the United States? Over here, you can see somewhat of an alarmist attitude towards the growing debt of the US from the Peterson Foundation. And just to highlight, the debt at the current rate is growing at nearly $7 billion per day. And as pointed out by the foundation, this level of debt can harm the economy, threaten opportunities for every American. So what I want to do is put this perhaps into a bigger context, look at overall debt levels around the world, and even think in terms of where we stand as this is being recorded, where the US government is now, I think, into 4 weeks of shutdown because the Congress simply cannot agree to a continuing resolution to keep the government open. And the disagreement really arises with regard to the whole level of US debt and the deficits that contribute to that. The graphic over here on the right, which comes from this company or organization here, Voronoi, just recently published and rather a well put together graphic, shows you the history over the last 200 years of debt, federal debt in the United States. And as we walk across the timeline, you can see the numbers back here in the 1820s, 30s and so on were trivial in comparison to today's numbers. We can see here, for example, during World War II, the level of federal debt had reached up to 49 billion, and in 1975, 533 billion, just over half a trillion. By 2000, this was now 5.7 trillion. And as and when this was captured in 2025, this has now reached 38 trillion. Now, the graphic comes in two flavors, really. A logarithmic version, which is this idea here. And then if we focus on the linear rate of growth, then as can be seen here, the chart gets really rather silly because this now shows that over the last 10, 20 years, the increase has been essentially parabolic. Now, the debt in 25 at 37.6 trillion is equal to 125% of US GDP, gross domestic product. And the interest during 25 is expected to approach $1 trillion. The net interest payments are forecast to reach 1.3 trillion by 2030, 1.8 trillion by 2035. And with that expectation for 2035, the net interest payments would then be equal to more than 22% of overall federal revenues. Let's now look at the bigger picture involving global government debt. And once again, this very good graphic comes from the same source as the previous one and shows you the government debt of the largest of the world's economies. Once again, you can see the 38 trillion there for the US. And in 2025, the sum of all government debt has reached 110 trillion. US and China are the two biggest, and together they make up more than half of the world's total government debt. The top 5 countries, that would be US, China, Japan, UK and France, make up 2/3 of the world government debt, and the top 10, so we go a little further around here, we can now find 81% of total government debt. So it's fair to say that the larger economies, the G20 economies, are the ones where there is the largest concentration of government debt. Turning to the graphic over here on the left, this is a very closely monitored metric. For example, one that people often cite with regard to, say, the rates of interest that governments need to pay when they issue government bonds. This has to do with government debt to GDP, the ratio. And right up here at the top as the outlier, and it has been so for many years, is Japan, with the debt to GDP ratio at 255%. This all relates back to problems that go back quite a long time, actually, having to do with the collapse of the Japanese stock market and real estate sector in the late 80s, early 90s, and the efforts by the Japanese government to try to stimulate their economy. Greece, which went bankrupt, for example, in 2012, has a very high ratio, 168, followed by Singapore, same number. Italy at 144. The average for the G7 is 128, which is more or less exactly where the USA is. And we can see numbers for France, Portugal, Spain, UK. Germany actually has one of the lower ratios for the so-called advanced economies, according to the source down here. Now, we've so far looked at government debt, but if we then widen the scope or expand the scope to bring in private debt, we can see the levels over on the right-hand graphic. So back here in 2016, the global debt, that includes government or public debt plus private, was 220 trillion. And as of the end of 24, this had risen to 315 trillion. And it's useful to see here that along the timeline, we have this kind of milestone in 2020, which of course represents the onset of the COVID pandemic. And also we can see a real surge, really, sizable spike in levels of public and private debt as we were having to contend with the challenges posed by the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, what I wanted to do in this graphic was contrast the level of federal spending in the United States between 2019, which would of course be before COVID, versus the level as of this year. This covers the first half of 2025, according to the Congressional Budget Office. So the key things to pay attention to maybe net interest as a percentage of overall federal spending in 2019 was 8%. And as of the middle of 25, this now has expanded to 14%. That is a very sizable increase and reflects what we saw on the last slide, which is the very substantial increase in both government and private debt as a result of COVID. And we can see that with regard to other entitlements, for example, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, the numbers have been increasing, but not really to the same extent that the interest payments on the public debt have, as I just mentioned. Defense here is at 12%, according to the CBO. We are now in the unusual position that the interest the US has to pay on its debt is actually more than it spends on defense. Let's have a look at the US federal deficit now. And the graphic over on the left here is quite revealing and puts it perhaps even into a slight sort of political context. If we go back to 1960, and this is more or less up to date, we can see what happened to the federal budget, whether it was in surplus or deficit, and we can see the various presidents of the United States and their obviously political affiliations follow up here at the top. Now, the only real period during this 60 plus years shown here where the US managed to achieve a budget surplus was back here during the Clinton administration. And surpluses were achieved in 1998 through 2001. And in 2000, the surplus was 236 billion. Now, entitlements, the ones I mentioned, mandatory programs such as Social Security, Medicare, now account for almost 2/3 of the federal budget in this time frame here where we are now, compared with less than half when Clinton was in office during the 1990s. And one very pertinent statistic that helps to explain the challenges now faced by different administrations in the United States is that the share of the population aged 65 and older, essentially the baby boomer generation, has grown from 12% in 98, when the surpluses were being achieved by Clinton, to more than 18% as of 2024. The final graphic that I want to just have a quick look at relates to the credit ratings as provided by the three big credit rating agencies, Moody's, Standard & Poor's and Fitch. Given all the background and context that I've just gone through, the levels of debt and debt to GDP and so on, and as can be seen on this graphic, there are 11 sovereigns, countries, which currently have a AAA rating from all the three major agencies. Moody's has its own classification system with capital A followed by two smaller A's, but it's AAA. S&P and Fitch use essentially the same lettering system for rating sovereigns. And you can see the 11 countries which do currently have, or as of the date down here, a AAA rating. Now, let's just focus on three down here that are included in this graphic. Finland, which used to have a AAA rating, was downgraded by all the agencies, as indeed was Austria, and in fact the United States now does not enjoy a AAA rating from any one of the three agencies. Up until May of this year, Moody's did have the United States rated at AAA, but they downgraded the US in May of 2025, and as can be seen, S&P, which downgraded the US a long time ago, back in 2011, I believe it was, which is again the reason behind that, which S&P stated at the time, was because of a shutdown of the government, because Congress were unable to come to terms with the continuing resolution allowing them to continue functioning. And Fitch also downgraded the US some time ago to AA+. The 10-year yields that are seen over here are somewhat out of date, but I can say that as and when this is being recorded, the US is currently paying effectively 4% to borrow in the Treasury market with a 10-year US Treasury note. Well, I hope very much that you found that discussion to be of value and useful and interesting. And could I once again remind you to subscribe to my channel, the Corcoran Codex. It will allow you to receive notifications as to when I add new material, which I do on a regular basis. All of the material is around this general topic of analyzing critical ideas and episodes in the world of global finance. Might I also just take this opportunity to mention two books that I have written over the years, both published by Wiley, and you can see them there. Thank you very much for watching.